Hello, my name's Roisin, and you asked for it, so here it is. Hello friends, so this video is a part 2 of sorts, but it is entirely independent, so even if you haven't seen part 1, stick around for this video. But if you are interested, I did make one of these before, so I'll leave it in the cards above and you can check it out when this one's over. So today we are talking about book club books. As I mentioned in my first video on this subject, I feel like there are certain aspects that are really important for a book club book. They don't have to be the best books ever or your favourite books ever, although those often do work because I find books that we love tend to be more divisive than books that we think are just okay. And I think that divisiveness is really good in a book club book because it inspires more discussion. But that means that these books on this list are not all books that I necessarily thought were my favourites. They were ones that I thought could inspire good discussion. So my criteria are that they have good themes and ideas that are part of the book, which I think is most of what a book club discussion usually tends to be around. It's about the themes and ideas of the books more than the form or the style of the writing, although that can come part of it as well. The second part though does relate to the style of the writing because I think that the writing needs to be accessible. Although some of you and myself might love stream of consciousness or very wordy verbose writing or something very experimental, that doesn't necessarily always work for a book group. Reading for a book group shouldn't feel like a chore, it should feel like a pleasure. Otherwise people are much less likely to start the book, finish the book, feel intimidated or put off by the style of the writing. So while this is not me saying the writing has to be super basic because everyone in your book club is not going to get your cool experimental books, it's just me saying that the writing has to be something that's more on the commercial accessible end than something super experimental. And then my third point is that they shouldn't be too long. You have people in your book groups with varying different reading speeds, varying different schedules and busyness and life, and so you don't want to pick for them a really big 800-page book for them to read in a month or 6 weeks or however long your book group is, only to find that 80% of the people on your book group hadn't even finished the book. Under 400 pages is good and under 300 pages is even better. Although there is one book on this list that is rather chunky, so maybe keep that for a book club where you know people love long books or where you have maybe 2 months to read your book. So last time I gave you 10 books that I think are perfect for book clubs. This time I'm going to be talking about 12 because I had 22 when I made my original list and so I didn't think there was enough for a third attempt. So we're just going to go with the 12 books that were on the rest of my list. The first one I have on here is The Confessions of Frannie Langton by Sara Collins. This is a gothic novel, although written now. It is historical fiction set in the 1820s between Jamaica and London. It regards a woman called Frannie Langton, who at the beginning of the novel we know is on trial for the murder of her employer and his wife. She is a woman who was enslaved in Jamaica but was to London when slavery had been abolished in the UK, although it hadn't been abolished in the rest of the empire. Although she is then given as a gift to the man in the house that she starts to work in. So this book is very gothic in style. It covers themes of race and race science in particular. The man who had enslaved her and also the man for whom she works now, both of them are race scientists, and so it covers those ideas of racism, the sort of natural basis for race and superiority or inferiority of certain races as believed in the Victorian period. It also covers ideas of gender and sexuality and is written in a really interesting way because, as the title suggests, it's the Confessions of Frannie Langton, so we're hearing things from her perspective as she is confessing in prison. It is a really dark gothic novel and I feel like there's so much to sink your teeth into, but for people who love a mystery, who love an unreliable narrator, who love that kind of Victorian gothic fiction but want something a bit new and fresh, I think that this would work really well. There are those themes to chat about, but there is also a desire to know what actually happened and who actually committed the murder, which I think can make this accessible as like a historical fiction but also a thriller but also a bit literary, so it covers a lot of your bases. Next I have The Mercies by Kiran, Millwood, Hargrave. This is another piece of historical fiction, which I do love historical fiction, so I will leave links to my videos about historical fiction in the cards above, so it's not a surprise. But The Mercies by Kiran, Millwood, Hargrave is based on a real story. A group of women on an island off the coast of Norway called Finnmark, where most of the men on the island were lost in a storm fishing accident. So the women have to fend for themselves, and the King of Denmark is sending around these commissioners to try and ethnically cleanse the Sami people and also to hunt witches. This is an incredibly beautiful but much more slow moving novel centred around the characters of Maren and Ursa, who Ursa is the wife of this new commissioner, and Maren lives on the island. It is about small communities, it's about witch hunts and gender, it's about sexuality, and it's about like trapped and entrapment and how people can feel trapped. I think this one has such beautiful writing, and again there is that kind of threat and terror of what's going to happen to these women once these witch hunter arrives on that island. So there's definitely a strong through line to pull people through who are more plot based, but there is also a lot of slow moving character tension going on that for people who enjoy that, and then also the beautiful writing where the setting and the atmosphere are really reflected in the style of the writing. So I think there's something for everyone, as well as a lot to discuss. I think that witches and witch hunts always bring up a lot of interesting discussion points. Number 3, I feel like this is just historical fiction to read with your book club. Number 3 is Hamnet by Maggie O'Farrell. I think this one probably is on a lot of people's book club lists, as it won the Women's Prize for Fiction last year, which I think often goes on book prize lists for that reason. This tells the story of Hamnet, who is the son of Shakespeare, who died, and it is about his life leading up to this death, and also his Will Shakespeare and Anne Hathaway, how they met, and then also the effects of grief on this family. Shakespeare is never mentioned because although this is the specific boy that we are talking about, this book is more about family grief and loss, and also what that would be like in the 16th century in a middle-class family in a sort of middling-sized town. It talks about pandemics and plague, which could be an interesting talking point, particularly after the past year we've had, but also it talks about like a women's place. It talks again a bit about witchcraft and things like that. I think this is one that does walk that commercial literary line very, very well. It has some beautiful writing, but again I think is very accessible, and I think that is the emotion and the impact of this book that make it have that drive for people who don't read as much, or who prefer something with a bit more plot as opposed to the sort of more literary philosophical novels. But I think that themes of sex and gender, again, I think would be really well discussed here, and also the idea of home and family life and history, and whose history we tell. Next, not a historical fiction this time, but a thriller, and that is My Sister the Serial Killer by Oyinkan Braithwaite. Although this is a thriller, it is not like that fast-paced thrillery, and there is no mystery to it. The title says what happens: My Sister the Serial Killer. It is told from the perspective of a woman whose sister keeps murdering her boyfriends, and in the beginning her sister thinks that it is self-defense, so she helps her hide the bodies, but she begins to get more and more suspicious, especially when her sister starts dating the man in whom she is interested. This one is very dark, very satirical, quite comic, and it has kind of quite a lot of tension in terms of, is she going to murder people? Are they going to get caught moving bodies? So I think that can be that can work very well, as well as the humour, but it also has a lot of biting satire and about gender and violence against women in Lagos in Nigeria. The discussions of the justifications for murder I think could be really interesting. Whose side are you on? Especially as we see both of the sisters start to unwind a bit towards the end of the novel. I think that you could do a lot to talk about the satire element of this, so I think there is a lot to discuss, and it's also always interesting to read books from cultures that are different to your own if you're not from Nigeria, and I think it's good to try and like diversify the books that you're reading so that not everything you're reading is coming from a similar perspective in your book group. Number 5 is another Nigerian book, and that is The Girl with the Louding Voice by Abby DeRay. So this is about a girl called Aduni, and it is her life from being sort of sold for her bride price to a older man who wants another wife. He already has two, and then when a tragedy happens in that household, she then runs away and ends up being sold into domestic servitude. So there is a lot of tragedy that happens in this novel, and it is a very, very sad book with some very difficult scenes. So I would say trigger warnings for violence against women and sexual violence and birth trauma in relation to these books. If that's something that maybe you don't want to touch with your book group, that's perfectly understandable. But it is a book that I think, even though it does deal with such difficult things, there is a lot of hope, and that hope particularly comes from the character of Aduni, who is incredibly endearing and always herself and always striving for an education and a louding voice. I think this book, again, is very, very accessible, particularly if you have people in your book group who often read YA. I would say that this is a step into literary fiction from YA. The way that it talks about education, the way it talks about colonialism and gender, and the intersections of gender and class could make for really interesting discussions with your book group, because we see women from different class backgrounds, and also women who have studied in England and then come back, and how that affects their look on culture, and we see how sexism affects women, and also about how class affects how those women treat one another. So I think that there is a huge amount in there to have a lot to talk about with that novel. Number 6 is a Singaporean novel, and that is How We Disappeared by Jing Lee. This is a story that is based in the Second World War, and I know that Second World War fiction is an incredibly popular type of historical fiction. This novel, however, is set in Singapore during the Second World War, which is an aspect that is not often treated in a lot of the World War fiction that we come across, which is usually set in the Blitz or in France or sometimes in Germany. This is from a completely different perspective, which I think makes it compelling for people who don't enjoy World War II fiction. I myself am someone who is often sceptical of World War II fiction, but I think that this one really did very well. Split into dual timelines, so we follow a woman during the Second World War when the Japanese invade Singapore and kidnap women, and then also in the early 2000s when there is a commission, a report into what happened to these women, and also a boy who's just lost his grandma is finding out more about her past after she passed away. And so we see about like class in Singapore and the effects of the war on Singapore, and also the effects on modern Singapore, how that treats people who are poor and old. It's also about the Japanese practice of comfort women, which were women who were sexually enslaved. So again, there is violence against women, sexual violence and war as trigger warnings for these books. I think it's done in a really delicate balance, in a way that we do feel the horror of these books, but we also feel the camaraderie of these women, and that's where a lot of the hope comes from. And it's a very powerful book, again, about finding your voice and helping people to talk about their trauma in the second half, more modern parts of this book. I think it would be interesting discussion about parts of history that we don't learn about here. If you are from outside of Singapore or outside of Asia, then it would be a discussion of parts of World War II that we just don't hear about. And I think that that makes it a very interesting book to read and discuss. Another book from East Asia, and that is Kim Jiyoung, born 1982, by Cho Nam Joo. This is potentially the shortest book on my list, so if you are from a group of slow readers, I read this in about 2 hours one day, so it's very, very short, and I think that that can be perfect for if you are doing something in a rush, or you just want a very quick book for your book group, but one that packs in so much. And I would urge people to persevere if they struggle with the style of the writing, because this is not in a way that makes it hard to actually read the words, but is very written in a very cold, clinical way, which is kind of for a good reason, and I think that that is important that it's written in that way, but I know a lot of people struggle with detached writers. This tells the story of every woman, and at the beginning of the novel we find out that she's had a mental breakdown, and then we go back in time to her life, and we follow through her life in Korea, looking at all of the sexism that she's experienced, her mother and her grandmother have experienced. Women should be in the home, boys are more superior and treated better at school, and then also at work, and cameras in toilets and things like that. And it's kind of very specifically from a Korean perspective, but as if you are a non-Korean reader, you can see how it relates to the world, and eventually how that leads to her having a breakdown. All of the like microaggressions that feel like you can't complain about them, and how that leads to a wearing down of women. And then there is just like a sting in the tail that I think makes this book really, really excellent. It's written in such an interesting way with like footnotes and resources to studies that have studied some of the things that are going through, which I think again would be an interesting thing to discuss. Why does this have citations in it? Does that add to the book? Does it make you feel more disconnected from the story, or does it make you feel like the universality of this story, or why do women have to back up their own experiences all the time? I think there's lots of very different interesting points you can come to in this novel. Next, a book from Latin America, and that is A Long Petal of the Sea by Isabel Allende. This is a historical fiction family saga style thing, which again I know can be very, very popular. It has a strong sense of character to follow through the whole narrative, which I think can help people get to the end. It tells the story of the Spanish Civil War. There's a doctor and a woman who is engaged to his brother who end up having to flee Spain at the end of the Civil War because they were on the communists' side and then the fascists won. So they flee into France, they end up in refugee camps, and eventually a ship comes and takes them to Chile, and it's about their new life in Chile and the family that they interact with there, their kind of sponsors in Chile. And it follows through their whole lives right up until like the early 2000s, the prime ministership of Allende, and then the dictatorship of Pinochet in Chile and having to flee to Colombia, which is something that Isabel Allende, as the niece, I think, of the Prime Minister Allende, had experienced herself. This has a lot of plot in it, and it covers a large amount of history, which I think means that there could be a lot to discuss in terms of that. And again, if you're not from Chile or from Spain, I feel like it's pieces of history that you don't necessarily know. It also covers ideas of love and of ideas of relationships, of building relationships, of passion and of stability, which I think is really interesting, and lots of cultural things. It's about refugees, so I think that that is another very pertinent topic in this book that can be an interesting discussion, like the treatment of refugees, our understanding of refugees. It's a novel with a lot of warmth and a lot of hope and a lot of people to like get to know, which I think can be something that some people really appreciate in books. They really want to relate to characters. And so, as opposed to Kim Jiyoung, which was written in that distanced way, this is very much a warm, hearty novel. And so I think if that's your jam, that would work really, really well. Next, I have Hot Milk by Deborah Levy. And this is a book about a girl whose mother has an illness that you don't know if it's psychosomatic or not, but she's going to Spain to try and get some treatment that she's not receiving from the NHS. And so she goes to Spain with her daughter, and it's their experience there of the treatment from this doctor and of Europe and European identity. Sophia, the girl, is half Greek, and she and her father abandoned her, and so she ends up going to Greece and then coming back to Spain. It involves queer relationships, and it's also about mother-daughter relationships. It's about what does psychosomatic actually mean, and the idea of like mental health and also physical health. There's a lot of like Greek mythology overtones in this. This is potentially the most like esoteric of all of these novels, although I still think it is quite accessible, but potentially it's the least like plot driven, and so if you have a very plot driven book group, they might find this one a little boring, but it's always good to stretch yourself outside of your comfort zone with book group books as well. This one was written before Brexit, and so it has lots of interesting ideas about like Europe and Europeanism, and about dual identities, mother-daughter relationships, and chronic illness. I think can be very interesting, and the way that people from outside of a chronic illness understand it. It's a very, very dreamlike novel, and I think that there is, despite the very shallow surface, there is a lot to get your teeth into. Next, an Australian novel, and that is The Secret River by Kate Grenville. This is another piece of historical fiction about a boy from London who ends up being convicted of theft and being sent to Australia as a convict, and then becoming a coloniser of Australia as well. His family come with him to Australia, and we see their experience of their new land and also the violence of colonialism. So again, there is a fair amount of violence in this book and racism, which I would warn you about, but it is really interesting the way it looks at class and how that interacted with colonialism. Because obviously colonial policies come from the top, but who are the people on the ground, which was an interesting perspective, and the origins of Australian colonialism. So it's set in the 18th century, I believe, but the first third of the novel is set in London, and so we hear a lot about what it was like to be in London in the 18th century and class in London, the criminalisation of the poor. We also hear about like white women's violent involvement in colonialism, which I think is an interesting perspective that often white women kind of distance themselves from, but is definitely very prominent in this book. And it's one that has like really beautiful descriptions of Australia and the Australian like nature, but is also really like tense. There's a lot of tension and some really, really horrible characters in this book. Feel like they have no other choice, but you can see that they do have another choice. So it's an interesting like idea of perspective as well. It is a very violent book, so I would be careful of that if that is something you would wish to avoid. There is a lot of racial violence. Then number 11 is Do Not Say We Have Nothing by Madeleine Tien. This is a book set in China from the 1950s up until the 1980s, and then it's also set in Canada. So it's about a girl and her mother, who this young girl, who I think is her cousin, the mum's niece, comes over to Canada as a refugee after the Tiananmen Square incident in China, and she tells her parents' life story, her like family's life story, to the young daughter while she's there. And we hear about the Maoist revolution in China, and then the Cultural Revolution, which happened later, and then we hear about like what it was like to grow up under the totalitarian communist state in China, and then we also hear it, but it's also about music and a love of music. It's incredibly beautifully written, so much to get your teeth into in terms of the way it's written. But again, there are lots of themes to discuss about totalitarianism and communism, about history you maybe haven't studied and might be new to you. So there's a lot of learning you can do, secrets and who you can and can't talk to, and having to sneak things out through Hong Kong, I think is another aspect of it that would make for great discussion. And it's about love and what you do for love, whether that's a love of a person or a love of something like music, and also about how people get like swept up into the hysteria of fanaticism and totalitarianism and how people rebel. The final book I'm going to recommend is the Poisonwood Bible by Barbara Kingsolver. This is the one that is a chunky book, so only if you have people who love to read chunky books or you've got a little more time to read it would I recommend this one. This is set in the Belgian Congo in the 1950s. It is about a man who moves there as a missionary to try and convert people to his brand of evangelical, extreme conservative Christianity, and he moves there with his wife and their 4 daughters, and the perspectives all shift between the 4 daughters, and it is about the Congolese fight for independence during this time. And so we follow a big period of time, so a lot of it is about them trying to set up this church and their experience with the people in Congo and their like complete racist understanding of what's going on, and unwillingness to treat these people as people on the part of the father and the mother, but then how the different daughters react to that situation. And it's also about violence, again, because there is a controlling, abusive father in this book, and it's about the different ways that these girls get spread across the world during the fight for independence, and because of their different reactions to the situation over the course of like 30 years, I think. As this is such a long epic book, there are so many different perspectives, so many different ideas. It's a little more experimental in terms of the writing as well, but I think that it's so absorbing that it really works. It's incredibly beautifully well written, and if you wanted to have discussions about colonialism, I think that this book can really work for that, and about the role of Christianity in colonialism. So there you go, those are 12 books that you can read with your book group. I hope that they sound interesting to you. If you do read any of them with your book group, I would love to hear from you. Please let me know in the comments down below, and let me know what you think are good book group books, because I am part of a book group and we're always trying to find something to read next. Thank you for watching. Please remember to give this video a thumbs up if you liked it, and to subscribe. I put out new videos every Wednesday, Friday and Sunday, so I will see you again very soon. Thank you for watching. Bye bye!